Hello. All right. Welcome to session 3. I'm going to introduce Scott Coull here. I met Scott last night and learned that he lived in my city of Baltimore for a time in some of the sketchier neighborhoods, so good work on you. Now you work at FireEye, and you're going to talk to us about deep neural networks for malware classification. So thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Is this a decent volume? Yeah. Great. So thank you very much for the introduction. Before I get started, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Chris Gardner, who's here in the third row. He helped me out a ton with a lot of the lower level binary analysis stuff that I haven't done since I was in grad school, which is a really long time ago. So I'm sure I don't have to say this, but for everyone in this room, I'm sure has had an experience where they've done feature engineering and realized just how timely and costly of a process that is. That's actually even more so the case for something like malware classification, where you're working in a very, very particular niche problem area. And for instance, needing someone like Chris to help create those features. So it's pretty natural for us to actually ask the question, can we use all this great machinery that deep learning has given to us to shortcut some of that, to make that easier in some way? And in particular, over the last couple of years, there's been a number of works out there that have looked at convolutional neural networks and whether or not you can use them to automatically learn reasonable feature representations from raw binary data, right? So basically raw PE files, Windows PE files. And the work that's been out there, so last year at CAMLIS, my colleague Jeff, gave our initial sort of proof of concept model and some of the results there. There have been 2 papers since then. And by and large, the results are actually pretty encouraging, right? When you look at these, maybe not necessarily better than a traditional model that would have hand-engineered features, but reasonable. Now, if you're anything like me, you're really thinking, wow, how is that even possible for a convolutional network to do that, right? If you know anything about Windows binaries, they're basically, they have a ton of indirection in them. They're very malleable in terms of their structure. And then, of course, that malleability then goes on to define what the underlying syntax and structure of the underlying bytes that these models are learning from means, right? So what the actual meaning of those bytes are depends on that structure. So how is it possible that even though this model has no understanding of any of that, none of the structure, none of the syntax, it's still able to do a pretty reasonable job just looking at these raw bytes? And so that'll be kind of the crux of our talk today, right? The results I'll show you are kind of be my attempt at trying to find some methodologies for understanding exactly what these deep learning models are learning. Now, deep learning models on their own are already notoriously difficult to interpret, even in the best of cases, like images. You again add to that this whole malware classification domain, and you get an even more challenging problem again. And in particular, you have this semantic gap that becomes pretty evident. That is, a lot of the tools that you'd be able to use for your deep learning model will tell you, for instance, which segments in the binaries are interesting to it, but it won't tell you that that segment is in the code section or text section, in the header, or some other section. So you have this semantic gap between that representation and what most malware analysts would consider, like the disassembled code in terms of semantics. So the basis for our evaluation here is going to be our FireEye convolutional neural net model. And this is basically the same thing that Jeff presented last year. It's a pretty standard convolutional architecture here. We start out at the very bottom with 100 kilobytes of our binary. And so if it's greater than 100 kilobytes, we just truncate. If it's less than 100 kilobytes, we pad with a special padding token. That then goes in through a 10-dimensional embedding layer, which translates each of those bytes into a 10-dimensional vector. Then goes through several iterations of convolutional and pooling layers, finally a fully connected layer, and then we get our probability of malware at the top. So what I think is interesting here, and then, like I said, it's a pretty standard kind of model architecture. What I think is interesting in particular for these results is that as far as I understand, this is the first model that's been sort of trained on a production quality data set to be doing this type of analysis on. And I say production quality because we train this on over 15 million different Windows binaries. The split for that particular data set was between 80-20, goodware to malware. So you really have this sense that we're looking at, basically the limit of what some of these deep learning models can kind of learn, or the convolutional models at least, might be able to learn in terms of features from this data. So let's start off with some broad analysis, right? Looking at a whole bunch of different data files and seeing what kind of shakes out. And actually, this is pretty in line with what previous work has done, right? So previous work has gone and looked at, in general, a couple of files here and there and said, all right, I see where the locations and weightings of these different activations are, and here's what I think might be interesting of that. So we're going to do that at a slightly larger scale. So we're going to take our 15 million data set. We're going to shrink it down by random sampling to 4,000 PE files, which is going to have a 50-50 split this time. And our methodology for this particular section is pretty simple, right? So we're going to basically look at our first convolutional layer and really just try to understand where those filters in the first layer are activating and what the differences are in those activations between goodware and malware. So first thing we can look at here is basically our individual filters. So basically at that very first layer of the convolutional network, we have 96 convolutional filters. And so right here on the x-axis, we have each of the filter numbers. On the y-axis, we have the counts for the number of activations for those filters. And there's a couple of interesting things to bring out here, right? So first things first, you see two very obvious spikes. Basically, two filters are being used way more often than any other filter in this first layer. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that there are certain filters that are never used, which makes you wonder, just how particular some of the features in some of these filters are to very, very particular subpopulations. And we'll get to that in a little bit. In addition to that, if we split out this activation chart into malware and goodware, we can actually see one of the biggest things here is that filter 57 here is predominantly associated with malware, right? Filter 57 ends up having a lot more activations on malware than on goodware. Why? So we'll answer that in a little bit as well. Another way to kind of turn this on its head is to kind of look at the activations for each of the offsets within that file, right? So basically each of the byte locations within the files. And here, so on the x-axis, we have our file offsets. On the y-axis, we have the count of the number of activations across all those 96 filters that have hit those counts, or that have hit those filters at those offsets. Couple of things to point out here. So one is a lot of our results actually do follow along with some of the things that have been sort of anecdotally noted in some of these papers. So for instance, a lot of activations tend to happen towards the front of the file, in the headers or in the directories. What's really interesting to me again is when we split this out between goodware and malware. Goodware, you kind of notice, is kind of, I would say, squashed a little. The leading spike is only about 3,000 activations total, and it drops off to something that's very close to uniform very quickly. On the other side of things, for malware, you have 6,000, double the number of activations at that first spike, but then you continue to have activations throughout the entire body of these files. So the question is, what exactly is going on there? Well, one thing to note, of course, is that because of the variability and structure of these PE files, the same offset doesn't always mean the same thing at different files, right? So another way to kind of view this is by sort of aggregating those activations by their sort of semantic location within the file. So here we have, basically on the x-axis, our section names, as well as a couple of other things I'll explain. And then, of course, the count of the number of activations within each of those sections. The two things that are in here that are not section names are optional header and unknown. So optional header is just the PE optional header. That's pretty straightforward. Unknown is basically any byte activation that happened in a portion of the file that is not within the valid boundary of that file. So things that happen in weird places between sections, or things that happen as end of file data, that all gets kind of piled into the unknown class here. So now two quick things to point out. a huge increase in the number of text segment or text section, text section activations, right? So basically in the code. So you can kind of get the sense that malware somehow is activating more on some sort of interesting features in the code. The other thing is this unknown thing, which is a huge increase over what you see in goodware, which of course is this end of file data and things like that. So now we get we have some broad understanding here, right? We got some understanding that goodware is primarily focused on features at the front. Malware is kind of spread out across a bunch of different areas or sections here. In particular, these unknown sections. And so now the question is, in this next section, we want to do a deep dive. So we kind of set the table, right? We know, generally speaking, how things are interacting here. But now let's really go deep into some of these examples and see what, in particular, for those interesting areas, we've actually learned. So to do this, we're going to cut down on our data set. So we're going to focus on just 6 ransomware artifacts from these three ransomware families here. And we're going to basically do what I would call a bottom-up analysis of our model. So the first thing we're going to do, methodology-wise, is we're going to look and do an examination of our embedding layer and see if it gives us any hints at what the model might think is interesting in the data. We're then going to move up again to that first convolutional layer, and we're going to basically look at those places where the activations were that we just had talked about at a broad level. But this time we're going to do binary ninja disassembly of all those areas to try to get context for what exactly it means, like what exactly the underlying semantics are for those activations. And then finally, we're going to use a process called gradient chap, which I won't get into in the main part of the talk at least, to basically do end-to-end analysis. That means we're going to be able to find out for each byte segment whether or not that byte segment pushes the decision of the classifier towards malware or towards goodware. And why. And we can do the same disassembly procedure as we did in the previous section. So let's just dive into the embedding layer, right? So we have a 10-dimensional embedding layer. So the very first thing we did was perform hierarchical DB scan. It's a density-based clustering mechanism. And so that basically gives us a couple of things. Gives us clusters without us having to necessarily tell them how many clusters, as well as a bunch of outliers. And I'll tell you what my hypothesis is and why I did this. So when you are in this embedding topology and you have a very dense set of bytes being represented closely together in that topology, in terms of the penalty for switching those bytes or swapping those bytes in that dense cluster, it's relatively low, right? If you instead have an outlier who's not near anybody else, that basically means the model has somehow carved it out as its own unique thing that cannot be replaced easily without causing large penalties upstream as the data moves up the architecture. So let's give you a kind of a sense of what some of these are. So the chart at the bottom here is basically your outliers for this case. So this first column of outliers is basically things like common registers that are being used, padding bytes, a couple of opcodes like short jumps. You'll see later on, I don't actually have it called out here, but there's some different types of long jumps as well that are sort of called out separately. Another really interesting one, and one that we'll get into in a lot more detail in the next slide, is ASCII characters. So things like lowercase e, lowercase s, lowercase t. Now you might be thinking, all right, well, what could a model possibly be learning from ASCII characters that's useful for this? And I'll tell you. So filter 83, which is one of the highest occurring filters for that subset of 6 ransomware, was basically keying in particular, imports. And not just any imports that have lowercase e, lowercase s, lowercase t, and some 0 bytes. So over here on your right-hand side are basically the disassembly of those activation areas. The lines that have the star next to them are the lines that the activation actually occurred in, and then the other 2 are for sort of context purposes. But basically, if you kind of just quickly glance through it, you see the trend happening, right? You get ES for the end of process, E and T for get. Down here, you again get like R's and S's and T's for the string copy commands, APIs. You have some 0 bytes that are adding padding in there. So basically, we're now seeing this thing where it's actually finding interesting things about ASCII characters and now pushing them into that first layer of feature detector. Another interesting thing to dive into, right? So we had talked about filter 57 at the very beginning during our broad analysis. So what's that learning? Well, again, if you kind of look at this disassemble, you see, again, a pattern forming here. A whole bunches of pushes and then a call, or a bunch of pushes, a call, and then more pushes. So this filter has essentially learned this push call. Basically, it's function calls, right? And it's not just any function calls. It's function calls that have a lot of pushes in them. And in fact, and some of this is a little bit supposition, but you can make a strong argument that the function calls that do have a ton of parameters that need to be pushed before actually having the call tend to be Windows API calls, right? Things that are kind of useful or interesting in the system. So it's kind of interesting that here we get sort of on one hand, sort of the usage of the API. On the previous slide, we talked about sort of the import of the API. This is the usage of an API. But of course, because of all this indirection that goes on with offsets, it doesn't actually understand the correlation between the fact that I imported, get process, and then I used some other API later on. Now, I've been focusing on imports, but that's not really the only thing here. We also have a filter that caught basically a snippet of the Eternal Romance exploit here that's highlighted with the stars. So again, you kind of get this sense that there's a mix here. There's a mix of sort of these straight import features that are being detected at these low layers, as well as sort of code-related snippets that are being detected. Now, to wrap up this section, I just want to, and we'll get back to this specific example in a little bit, but what I want to do is just show the results of the end-to-end analysis to kind of give you a counterpoint to some of that. So here, again, on your x-axis are your file offsets. And on your y-axis, basically the more positive on the y-axis, the more that particular byte segment is associated with pushing the model to a malicious decision, whereas more negative is for more benign decision. And this is for the WannaCry worm. So what's interesting here is this really, really big spike all the way to the left actually happens on the checksum. Now, for those of you who have done malware classification, incorrect checksum is like the #1 most important feature, despite what you would think, to actually classify these things in a lot of cases. So it's interesting because this does not appear as a low-level feature, right? We talked about a bunch of code features and a bunch of interesting things. There's no like, I have a string of zeros feature that exists, at least in all the stuff that we've analyzed. And as a counterpoint here, we see the resource directory being used as basically the fact that there is a resource directory of a certain size is somehow being used here as a benign feature in its calculation. All right, so to kind of wrap up here, this is the last section. One of the things I really wanted to do was kind of compare what the model was learning and what it thought was interesting to what a reverse engineer, Chris in this case, thought was interesting. And so the methodology here is actually pretty simple. The data is the same. We're going to work on the same 6 ransomware artifacts. And the methodology is, like I said, pretty simple. So basically, the reverse engineer is going to go through these 6 examples, and he's going to find all the areas of interest that he thinks are related to sort of the maliciousness of that file. Then the CNN is going to go and find the top 100 of those first layer activations, as well as those end-to-end activations. And so what we can kind of do here is then swap and see what the overlap is. So here's that WannaCry worm example. And what we did is we gave some of these top segments to Chris, and he kind of basically said whether or not he thought it was a good or a bad or an indifferent effect, right? Basically, whether or not it was actually a good indicator or not. And so there's some interesting ones here, right? So we already talked about the checksum, which does tend to happen in when you're creating manual feature sets, but also some interesting stuff, right? So it keyed in on the fact that there's an area of this binary that should have a whole bunch of standard directories, like security directory and stuff that has the certificates, right? And it doesn't. So somehow it keyed in on the fact that it has an oddity in the directories. Another interesting thing is with this particular sample, there was actually an embedded PE file within it. And it caught sort of 2 sort of implicit indicators of that, right? So the .data section was showing that the virtual size was more than the actual physical size. So basically kind of trying to hide that PE file. And then it also hit on the actual import table and export table for that PE file. So again, you get sort of this interesting mix where, yeah, for sure the import stuff came out as important, but there was also these other things that we didn't necessarily see at the very lowest level in terms of like raw code, disassembled code that was interesting, but at the end, it kind of percolated up to what, at least in my perspective, are sort of really well understood, human understood features. And so to go the other way and to kind of start to wrap up here, we did this the opposite direction just to sort of see what the overlap was between Chris's areas of interest and these first level and end-to-end areas of activation. And basically we got a 30% and 10% overlap respectively, which when you consider the fact that, out of a possible 100,000 activations, we got 10 and we got 100 activations and got this much overlap. Actually shows pretty strong overlap between his intuition and what the model was really keying in on. And just to give you an idea of what some of these things kind of looked like, it's like, creating a task, identifying stack strings that looked weird, et cetera. So to summarize some of the findings here, right, just at a high level. So absolutely number one is implicit and explicit import features are playing a huge role here. And in particular, we saw this in the embedding layer, in the convolutional layer, and in the end-to-end analysis. We did see some lower level code features, but really that only ended up happening in those first convolutional layers. It didn't really show up in the end-to-end analysis, which I thought was interesting. And the sort of conversely for that, a lot of the end-to-end features that were at the top were actually what I would consider to be some of the most commonly used for manual features when creating a traditional machine learning model. And then finally, just to sort of highlight that there's quite a bit of overlap between what the analysts saw as interesting and what the convolutional network saw, though that tended, again, to happen mostly in those early convolutional layers, not necessarily the end-to-end analysis. So with that, I'll do one last plug. FireEye Data Science is hiring, so if you are interested in working on cool security problems in a research environment, we have many people here. We have some reverse engineers, a bunch of people from the data science team, a bunch of engineers here, so please find us and have a chat with us if you're interested. And with that, I'll open up to questions.
Given the amount of work you had to do to reverse engineer your model and the malware, what's your feeling on deliberately engineered features for a model versus these sorts of byte-based solutions and the trade-off between accuracy and explainability of that model?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think sort of my gut is that I think the best is somewhere in the middle, right? Taking some things that we would do manually with respect to feature engineering manually and trying to bring that in. So like one example, right, is I had mentioned the use of API calls, right? And the fact that because each thing has different offsets, you can never really make that connection across a whole bunch of samples. Instead of going through and just sort of saying, all right, well, forget about trying to learn that. Instead of doing that, we can actually do something that Binary API kind of does, or Binary Ninja kind of does, which is go through and kind of replace the offset with the actual API call name. So now it actually is correlated. Those two steps, like the usage and the import, are now related. So you can start to get some of that back. I would say, generally speaking, and I'm speaking personally, not as FireEye or anybody else in my group, that the features that I have seen come out of the deep learning model are strictly weaker, at least in my opinion, than what we have developed in our, for instance, MalwareGuard traditional model, right? And I think part of that is exactly because we're not doing anything to try to anything to try to deal with the the semantics and syntax and structure issues, right? I think if we start to normalize that and start to bring some of that information in before we do the sort of the equivalent level of byte-based training, I think you'd end up with a much stronger model that might actually get to more of those types of features that we ended up with in the traditional model. Thanks.
So continuing from the point that you just mentioned, so do you think selecting size as 100 KB as a threshold has an effect on this? Because it's a smaller size, so malware can, in mostly cases, will be a complete sample, whereas goodware will not be.
Yeah, no, I mean, so for sure, almost, I think everyone except for maybe Malcolm, which is like 2 megabytes, is going to be kind of in this scenario where, yeah, you just put a bunch of benign stuff and then you put the real stuff, you know, at whatever the threshold is. So for sure, that's always going to be a weakness until something comes along to really be able to fix that and still scale. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the entirety of your question or not, but I do think that that's definitely a weakness here. But it's all about trade-offs, right? So I think you would get, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but you get a large fraction of the files in that 100 kilobyte. And if you extend that to, I think, you know, another paper did like 512 kilobyte, you get the vast majority. So really, it's sort of a trade-off. Like, yeah, you're getting some benefits, but you have a knowing vulnerability there. It's this possible. Most of the files that I looked at were greater than 100 kilobytes, so that's very much possible. Yeah.
Did you do any work when you were constructing your benign data set to try and make sure that the features in the files had some overlap with, say, the malicious data sets, that you were really detecting something that's inherent to the file being malicious rather than just something that a lot of malware just tends to have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we do a pretty good job of trying to get a really robust data set. We do a lot of clustering and deduplication, so things don't get out of control in general with all of our data. I think you know, I think it's a little bit of a loaded question too, because I fundamentally I think a lot of the features that we end up, regardless of if you're talking about deep learning features or if you're talking about features that come out of traditional ML, a lot of those features do end up focusing more on sort of things that are not necessarily directly related to the maliciousness of, but they're things that, like, for instance, analysts would have seen very often in having, you know, analyzed these, right? So I think there's a fine line there, and you end up getting a little bit of both in this case.
What was the size of the receptive field after the last convolutional layer, if you know off the top of your head?
I think 512.
So I'm curious about the effect of the embedding layer, because over the summer I tried something similar, but my file sizes were very different. I had very small malware files and very large, but I didn't have an embedding layer. But I was doing padding, and I realized that in a lot of cases the network was just picking on padding. Like if the padding was above a threshold, it would just say, oh, this is this type of malware, which turned out to be just a function of my data. So I'm curious, you know, if you have any comments on the role of embedding. And you had, I think, 10 dimensions, and the role of dimension there.
Yeah, so that's a really good question too. At first, I think when I first jumped onto this project, so like when I very first joined, I asked this exact same sort of question, like, is the embedding layer really teaching us anything? Like, is there any benefit here other than the fact that it just makes for a more tractable problem size-wise? And I think based on the results that I have here, I think it's absolutely the case that it plays a huge role in trying to direct and focus higher level filters in getting, you know, for some version of the right features for the different data sets. Yeah. And in terms of dimensionality, it's actually interesting you mentioned that. So the approach that we took, you know, basically this SHAP thing, it only works on differentiable parts of your model. So it couldn't go through the embedding layer. So really what you end up with is, you know, like 10 dimensions by 100 kilobytes. And actually what happened with the SHAP model is it puts a weight on each of those dimensions and each of those bytes. And for our model, at least, the last 2 dimensions always had 0 weight, which to me at least, that implies that like we probably could have moved down to like 8-dimensional and been just fine and gotten the same results. So, sorry.
All right, thanks a lot. Let's thank our speaker one more time.